Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental moment in history, peel back all the layers, and really show you how the decisions made back then define the financial system you live inside today.
And today we're diving deep into a moment of just pure financial panic. We're talking about a 6-week stretch in the fall of 1907, where the entire U.S. economy came within, hours of a total systemic collapse.
It's a moment that's so defining, but it's often just glossed over. It's a required study if you want to understand the origins of the modern state. We're talking bank failures, stock market crashes.
The sources even detail riots in New York. Just desperate people trying to get their cash out of vaults that were already locked.
And the single most crucial fact here, the thing you have to understand to set the scene, is that the United States government was completely powerless. President Roosevelt, Congress, the Treasury Department.
Totally powerless. They had no legal mechanism, no tools. Critically, there was no central bank that could step in, inject liquidity, or stop the bleeding.
By design, the government just could not save the country.
And that brings us to this really astonishing realization that the country's financial fate rested entirely on one man, J.P. Morgan.
Right, who at this point is semi-retired. He's 70 years old, off and off cruising the Mediterranean on his yacht.
Exactly. But he was forced to come back to New York to personally organize this massive multi-million-dollar bailout. He was, for all intents and purposes, the de facto central bank, using his own private funds and, this extraordinary personal authority to stabilize the entire nation.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because the central thesis we're investigating today, it goes way beyond just the popular narrative of Morgan the hero, swooping in to save the day.
It does. Our sources suggest that this very crisis, this terrifying moment of near collapse, was strategically used by Morgan and his associates.
Right down.
It became the perfect, non-negotiable justification they needed to fundamentally restructure American finance. It led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve System just 6 years later.
So the crisis was the political opportunity.
Precisely. So our mission today is to trace that documented history. How the crisis made a central bank seem inevitable to the public. Why that new system was designed in total secret by the very bankers it was supposed to regulate.
You're talking about Jekyll Island.
The secret meeting at Jekyll Island. And most importantly, why that ultimate structure, a mechanism designed primarily to make sure banks never fail, is still fundamentally shaping our economy, dictating your interest rates and affecting your purchasing power today, well over a century later.
So before we get into the crash itself, we really need to spend some time setting the scene, just laying out the sheer absurdity of America's financial architecture in 1907.
It really was. Compared to European nations like Great Britain or Germany, the U.S. system was just decentralized, unregulated.
It was a recipe for guaranteed collapse.
It was institutionalized chaos. And the crucial starting point, the thing you have to get, is that America had no central bank. And this wasn't an accident, it was a deep historical tradition.
We tried it before, twice.
The first Bank of the United States, which was Alexander Hamilton's idea, it operated from 1791 to 1811. But when its 20-year charter came up for renewal, Congress just refused.
And that sentiment, that fear of centralized financial power, it just got stronger and really came to define a whole political movement in the 1830s.
Absolutely. The second Bank of the United States was created in 1816, but President Andrew Jackson personally orchestrated its demise in 1836.
Jackson saw it as a tool for the elite, right?
Exactly. He viewed the bank as a mechanism that funneled power and money from ordinary Americans to a small, privileged group of wealthy Eastern financiers. He famously vetoed the bank's recharter, essentially killing it.
And that Jacksonian opposition, that deep fear of a central bank controlled by Wall Street, that was a foundational American political belief that lasted for over 70 years.
It was. So after 1836, the country devolved into what historians literally call the free banking era. And by 1907, it was financial anarchy.
What did that look like on the ground?
It looked like over 20,000 independent banks, all operating under different state and national charters. They had no central coordination, very little oversight, and absolutely zero safety net.
So it's like 20,000 ships sailing on their own, and if one sinks...
It creates a tidal wave that swamps all the others, and that structural fragility was magnified by the core principle of banking then and now, fractional reserves. But back then, there was no government backstop.
Right, and I think it's critical we really drill down on how this makes the system so instantly vulnerable.
It's the core engine of instability. So, just to make sure we're all tracking, here's how it works. A bank takes in your deposit, but it only holds a tiny fraction of that deposit in actual cash or gold, maybe 10 or 15%.
And the rest is immediately lent out so the bank can earn interest.
Right. It works wonderfully, generates profit, expands credit, but it all relies entirely on one single factor: trust.
And what happens the second that trust vanishes?
The system collapses. If people hear a rumor, and it can be a totally false rumor, that their bank is shaky, they rush to withdraw their money. This is the classic run on the bank.
And since 85 to 90% of the deposits aren't actually in the vault,
The bank runs out of cash almost instantly, sometimes in a matter of hours. It becomes legally insolvent, even if its underlying assets, its loans, are perfectly sound.
the terror of that run was then amplified, tenfold by the complete lack of deposit insurance. Today, if your bank fails, the FDIC guarantees your deposits up to $250,000. But in 1907,
You lost everything, your life savings, your business's payroll account. It was just wiped out. That reality didn't just cause fear, it caused desperation. If you waited, if you hesitated, you were ruined.
which just accelerated the runs, it created a feedback loop of pure panic.
It did. And you have to layer on top of all of this the gold standard context.
Yeah.
Dollars were supposedly backed by gold, but the system had already created far more dollar claims than there was actual gold in the vaults to back them.
So it was already leveraged.
Hugely. The total amount of currency and credit in the system was way bigger than the physical gold reserve, this guaranteed vulnerability. If everyone decided to convert their paper dollars into gold at the same time, the system would just freeze. And that's essentially what these panics threatened to do.
A house of cards just waiting for a breeze.
Exactly. The system was just primed to fare the moment even the smallest tremor of distrust hit it. Hashtag 1.2, Morgan's pre-existing power.
So, given that the government had zero power, the only entity capable of stopping a full-blown panic was the private banking network.
That's it. And within that network, JP Morgan was the undisputed leader. He was effectively the lender of last resort.
He had played this role before, right?
He had. He'd refined this role over decades, organizing these voluntary ad hoc bailouts during panics in 1873 and 1893. These were just solutions where Morgan would essentially strong-arm his competing bankers into pooling their own reserves to stabilize the system.
He was the mechanism because there was no other mechanism.
There was no governmental alternative. And the sources detail the incredible leverage Morgan had, even over the federal government itself. The crisis of 1895 is just a crucial story here.
What happened then?
It's a stunning example of private power just completely superseding state power. In 1895, the U.S. Treasury was running dangerously low on its gold reserve. It was threatening to push the dollar off the gold standard entirely.
So President Grover Cleveland, he couldn't secure the funds.
He was forced to go, hat in hand, and beg J.P. Morgan to organize a gold loan. The President of the United States went to a private citizen.
That's unbelievable. And what did Morgan do?
Morgan organized a syndicate that provided $65 million in gold to the Treasury, which stabilized the dollar. But of course, he did so on his own terms, ensuring a nice profit for his syndicate.
And that action just cemented his role as the ultimate authority over American credit.
It did. He showed he could even override the U.S. government's ability to manage its own solvency. He held the financial keys to the kingdom.
So as we head into 1907, the question isn't really if a crisis would occur. That was sort of mathematically built into the system. The real strategic question for you to think about is this. When the system finally cracked, would Morgan choose to act? And what non-financial price would he demand for saving the nation this time? So we have this gigantic, perfectly fragile structure. What was the specific match that lit the fire in October 1907? It wasn't a war or a famine. It was just pure, reckless speculation.
Exactly. In the copper market, the immediate trigger was a spectacular failure engineered by two figures known for their ambition and, frankly, their ruthlessness. Augustus Heinz, a copper millionaire, and Charles Morse, a banking and shipping mogul.
And what was their scheme?
They decided to try and corner the stock of the United Copper Company.
Okay, so for listeners who might not be familiar with cornering a market, can you just walk us through the mechanics of that?
Sure. A very high-stakes manipulation. Their goal was to secretly buy up nearly every available share of United Copper stock. Once they controlled the supply, they planned to force this sudden, massive spike in the price.
Which they did. The stock went from $39 to $60 in just a couple of days.
Right. And the real targets were the people who had bet against the stock, the short sellers.
Because when you short a stock, you eventually have to buy it back to cover your position.
Correct. So Heinz and Morse were trying to squeeze these short sellers. Since the short sellers had to buy, And Heinz and Moore thought they controlled all the supply. They believed they could dictate an outrageously high price and make astronomical profits.
But it all fell apart. They miscalculated.
A critical failure in their math. They completely misjudged the total number of shares that were actually available in circulation. Short sellers managed to find shares from other markets, from obscure holders, and it undermined the corner entirely.
And the moment that manipulation failed,
The price went into a free fall. By October 16th, United Copper was trading at just $10 a share. The whole operation was a catastrophic failure, leaving the schemers and, critically, their creditors holding mountains of nearly worthless stock. Hashtag tag 2.2, the fall of the Knickerbocker Trust.
and the contamination point was immediate. Because the banks that were controlled by Heinz, and more specifically the Knickerbocker Trust Company, had been recklessly financing this whole speculation.
Using that inflated, now worthless stock as collateral, these banks were suddenly completely insolvent.
So the rumors start flying on October 17th.
They do. And Knickerbocker was a behemoth in the trust company sector, but it was operating on perilously thin margins. Remember our discussion of fractional reserves? Knickerbocker only had about 8% of its deposits held in cash.
So its president, Charles Barney, he recognizes the danger, and he frantically starts looking for a bailout loan.
And he goes straight to Morgan's associates. And this is where we see Morgan operating not just as a rescuer, but as a strategic player, shaping the market for his own benefit.
His people investigated the books.
I did. And they found Knickerbocker was just too deeply entangled. It was too far gone in the speculation mess. But the strategic decision by Morgan was key here. He consciously chose to let it fail. Knickerbocker was a major competitor to the national banks that Morgan favored and controlled. By letting it collapse, sure, he was cleaning up the system, but he was also eliminating a very powerful rival.
The consequences were swift and tragic. Barney resigned under pressure on October 21st, and the very next day, he took his own life.
The human cost was immediate and visible. And on October 22nd, the consequences for the public were also immediate. The run began. Sources describe this continuous, frenzied line of depositors stretching 2 city blocks outside the Knickerbocker headquarters on Fifth Avenue.
You can just imagine the atmosphere. That terrifying, quiet desperation of people realizing their life savings might just vanish.
And by 2 p.m. that afternoon, it was over. The vault was empty. The Knickerbocker closed its doors, and that single act triggered mass panic across the entire financial system. Hashtag Takeover 2.3, the cascade effect.
The failure of Knickerbocker was uniquely dangerous because of what trust companies were, right? They weren't exactly national banks.
No, they were an alternative, and they were much less regulated. They didn't have to hold high reserve balances, but they held huge amounts of the public's money. By 1907, trust companies held nearly 50% of the total deposits that the more strictly regulated national banks held.
So the failure of one giant trust signaled that the entire sector, holding half the nation's savings, was at risk.
Precisely. The panic immediately became a cascade. October 23rd saw runs spreading to other major institutions like the Trust Company of America, or TCA, the Lincoln Trust, the Empire City Trust.
The speed of the withdrawals must have been staggering.
It was. TCA alone faced $13 million in withdrawals in just 2 days. That amount, if you adjust her purchasing power, would be over $400 million today. A massive, immediate drain of liquidity.
So the liquidity crisis reaches its climax on October 24th, 1907. If the Trust Company of America fails, the contagion is going to leap back to the national banks, to the stock exchange.
Leading to a total national financial paralysis. We are talking about the entire system being hours away from a complete collapse.
And who was the only person with the cash and the authority to stop it?
JP Morgan, operating entirely outside the jurisdiction of the government.
It's genuinely hard to convey the cinematic drama of that week. The official centers of power, the Treasury, the White House, they were just mute.
Well, the actual center of power had shifted to Morgan's brownstone library at 219 Madison Avenue.
That library became the financial war room.
It did. On the evening of October 24th, the fate of the Trust Company of America hung in the balance. Representatives from TCA brought their financial ledgers to Morgan's home, and Morgan's trusted lieutenants, his sort of financial police, they worked through the night analyzing the assets.
And the crucial question they had to answer was, is TCA truly insolvent, meaning bad assets, a systemic failure, or is it just illiquid, meaning good assets, but just no cash on hand because of the panic?
At about 2 a.m., the verdict came in. TCA was fundamentally solvent. They had good assets, solid investments, but they desperately needed a massive short-term injection of cash to withstand the run and restore public confidence.
And Morgan's response was legendary. He wasn't going to spend his own money alone. He was going to force the entire banking sector to participate.
At 3 a.m., he summoned the presidents of New York's largest national banks. And this was not an invitation.
The bankers were hauled out of their beds and made to walk through the dark streets to Madison Avenue.
And this detail is key to understanding Morgan's command presence. When they were all assembled, Morgan physically locked the library doors. No one was leaving until he got what he wanted.
He effectively held the leaders of the nation's finance hostage. What was his demand?
He demanded they pool $25 million immediately for a loan to TCA, with each bank contributing an amount based on its size and reserves. His ultimatum was merciless and simple.
Pool your resources and save this one institution to stabilize the market.
Or the panic will destroy each of you individually and in sequence. You either cooperate for collective survival or you face annihilation.
That kind of concentrated absolute authority exerted by a single private citizen, it's almost unimaginable today.
But it secured the system. The agreement was hammered out by 4:45 a.m. The result was immediate. TCA opened its doors the next morning with plenty of cash visible. The run slowed, public confidence returned, and the institution survived.
And this single action proved the overwhelming power of concentrated liquidity.
Money created out of thin air, organized by a private individual, to stabilize the public's perception of an inherently fragile system. Hashtag 3.2, saving the stock exchange.
But the crisis was accelerating on a second front. The stock exchange itself. This is where the liquidity crisis really threatened to paralyze business operations across the entire country.
Absolutely. The stock market relies so heavily on margin lending. Brokerage firms loan their clients money to buy stocks, using the stock itself as collateral. But they in turn borrow that cash from banks.
So as the banks needed cash to cover depositor runs, they started calling in those loans to the brokerage firms.
Right. And the brokers, having nowhere to turn, were forced to liquidate their client holdings.
Yeah.
Massive forced selling, which caused the market to crash further, just feeding that panic loop.
And by noon on October 24th, the situation was catastrophic.
The president of the New York Stock Exchange, a man named R.H. Thomas, personally rushed to Morgan's library with a terrifying warning. Unless $25 million was secured and injected into the market in the next 10 minutes, the exchange would have to close.
Closing the NYSE would have been the ultimate catastrophic public admission of systemic failure. It would have restarted the panic globally.
Would have been game over. And this 10-minute deadline, it's an impossible timeline.
Yet Morgan pulled it off.
Morgan didn't ask or negotiate. He immediately commanded the heads of the most stable national banks to produce the cash. His word was law in that room. In that moment, the money arrived, distributed by multiple couriers, by 12:15 p.m.
Just in time. It stabilized the market and kept the exchange operating.
And the lesson here for the system was so clear. Private, concentrated power could mobilize cash faster and more effectively than any government mechanism could ever hope to. Hashtag 3.3. Rescuing the city of New York.
And as if managing the trust companies and the stock market wasn't enough, Morgan then had to intervene to save the local government.
That's right. The city of New York needed to roll over $30 million in short-term bonds.
Which is a liquidity problem hitting a municipal government.
Exactly. Banks, who were hoarding cash just to survive their own runs, they refused to buy the city's bonds. If New York City defaulted on its debt, it would be an international financial scandal.
A sure signal that the U.S. financial system was completely broken.
And it would trigger a fresh wave of national panic. So, Morgan organized a third consortium on October 26th. And he expanded his reach this time, didn't he? He went beyond just the banks.
He had to. He brought in insurance firms, trust companies, major industrial companies, all the large corporations that had a vested interest in New York's stability.
He essentially forced them to see that the city's solvency was tied directly to their own self-preservation. It was a complete top-down enforcement of stability. By October 28th, the bonds were successfully sold.
The crisis was averted, and Morgan emerged as the undisputed, irreplaceable savior.
The brilliance of the man is undeniable. But what this next section illuminates is that this was not purely altruism. He used this crisis to extract an extraordinary price for his actions.
This is the critical juncture where that narrative of the savior gives way to the blueprint for future systemic exploitation.
It is. By early November 1907, most of the immediate runs were contained. But one last failure threatened to unravel everything again. The brokerage firm Moore and Schley.
Right. Moore and Schley owed the banks $25 million, and their primary collateral was stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, TC&I.
And as the panic crushed stock values, the value of that collateral was collapsing. The banks wanted their money back, but if they liquidated the TC&I stock, if they dumped $25 million worth of company shares onto the open market,
The price would collapse, Moore and Schley would fail, and it would instantly reignite the panic across the entire financial district.
the banks needed a buyer who could take all that stock off their hands immediately and discreetly. Hashtag tag 4.2,
Wow.
Morgan's strategic acquisition.
And JP Morgan saw an opportunity that went far beyond just stabilization.
So far beyond. His industrial giant, U.S. Steel, already controlled about 60% of America's steel production. TC&I was a crucial rival in the southern market, holding these valuable assets and resources.
So this was a chance not just to help his banking associates, but to eliminate a major competitor and consolidate his dominance in the industrial sector.
The move was pure strategic brilliance. He was leveraging a financial crisis for a permanent industrial gain.
But there is a massive legal hurdle: antitrust law. President Theodore Roosevelt was the famous trust buster.
Right. Buying TC&I would push U.S. Steel close to 70% control of the American steel market, which was exactly the kind of massive anti-competitive monopoly Roosevelt was sworn to break up.
So Morgan's partners, Elbert Gary and Henry Frick, were dispatched to Washington. They met with Roosevelt at the White House on the morning of November 4th.
And they argued not for profit, but for stability.
What was their core argument to Roosevelt?
They presented him with a choice. They argued that the purchase of TC&I by U.S. Steel was the only available mechanism to prevent the stock's liquidation, which in turn was the only way to save the financial system from collapsing again.
So his choice was either stick to his political principle of trust busting or face economic ruin for the entire country.
Exactly. And Roosevelt, facing the political impossibility of restarting a national panic, he blanked.
He granted them an assurance.
An explicit assurance. After consulting with his attorney general, Roosevelt promised that the government would not pursue antitrust action against U.S. Steel for the TC&I acquisition. It was a complete political surrender, justified by the immediate crisis.
And the outcome: U.S. Steel bought TC&I for $45 million. And later analysis showed this price was significantly below market value, didn't it?
Oh yes. Independent analysts later assessed the purchase price at nearly 50% below fair value. Morgan used the financial crisis and the government's paralyzing fear of systemic failure to consolidate his industrial empire at a massive discount, with the government's direct blessing and immunity from legal repercussions.
That structural insight is so vital for our deep dive today. The precedent set here wasn't just a one-off business deal, it was a demonstration that in a crisis, the government would prioritize stability over competition or principle.
And in doing so, it allows the strongest financial players to grow stronger and consolidate power. That precedent would become the core structural principle of the system they created just 6 years later.
So by mid-November 1907, the financial panic has subsided, and the credit for saving the nation rightly goes to Morgan. The immediate public consensus was undeniable. The status quo was unsustainable.
The national conversation completely shifted. The question wasn't if we needed reform, but how to institutionalize that bailout mechanism. Why should the stability of the entire U.S. economy depend on the life and whim of a single 70-year-old private banker?
Right. Every major European power had a central bank. The Bank of England, the German Reichsbank, an institution that could create immediate liquidity. America clearly needed one too.
But we established that political obstacle was enormous. That ingrained Jacksonian opposition to a central bank controlled by powerful Eastern bankers had never truly faded.
So if Morgan or the New York financial elite had openly proposed a central bank, it would have failed instantly.
So the solution had to be built in secret, and it had to be packaged in a way that appeared to address those democratic fears while still securing the interests of the powerful.
And the push for reform was politically channeled through the creation of the National Monetary Commission.
Led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Republican from Rhode Island, and crucially, an in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., making him a firm political ally of Wall Street. Hashtag 5.2. The secret meeting at Jekyll Island, 1910.
So 3 years after the panic, in November 1910, Aldrich takes the reform process completely underground. He organizes a highly private, highly secret meeting at Jekyll Island, Georgia.
Jekyll Island was, at the time, this exclusive private resort frequented by the ultra-wealthy. Secrecy was paramount. Our sources emphasize that the attendees traveled separately. They used only first names during transit to avoid tipping off reporters.
The entire planning was done without any official minutes or records to avoid public scrutiny.
This was, in effect, a banking conspiracy designed to produce a public institution.
And who were the key architects in that room representing the nation's financial elite?
Well, besides Senator Aldrich, you had all the major banking powers: Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's firm; Frank Vanderlip, who was president of the massive National City Bank, closely associated with the Rockefeller interests.
And Paul Warburg, right. He was instrumental.
Perhaps the most instrumental, a German immigrant and investment banker at Kuhn Loeb & Co., who had extensive experience with European central banking models. They were the key creditors and debtors of the nation, designing the system that would regulate, backstop, and financially support their own institutions.
And their mission over those 9 days?
To draft the complete structure, the full architecture of what would become the Federal Reserve System. They had to create an institution powerful enough to end panics, but decentralized enough in its appearance to pass Congress.
And ensure that the ultimate control over money creation remains securely in the hands of private finance.
Precisely.
The structural design that emerged from Jekyll Island was, it was political engineering at its finest. It was packaged for public consumption as government reform, but underneath, it was strategically engineered to benefit the bankers who drafted it.
The primary strategy was the illusion of decentralization. This was designed specifically to overcome that deep-seated Jacksonian fear of Wall Street control. Instead of one powerful centralized bank like the Bank of England, they proposed 12 regional Federal Reserve banks.
So it looked like financial power was distributed across the nation.
Exactly. And to complete the political packaging, they placed a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, whose members were appointed by the president. This provided the indispensable appearance of governmental oversight and accountability.
But the reality of control was rooted in the mechanism of ownership. And this is the detail that you really need to remember.
It's everything. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are not government agencies. They were designed to be, and they remain, private corporations owned by their member banks. National banks were required to buy stock in their regional Fed.
So the banks themselves literally owned the system that was supposed to be policing them. And that stock purchase wasn't just a requirement, it was profitable, wasn't it?
Highly profitable. That stock paid a guaranteed 6% annual dividend. The private banks were guaranteed a perpetual profit stream just for being part of the system. And on top of that, those same private banks elected 2/3 of the regional Federal Reserve Bank's board of directors.
So let's just lay this out clearly. The banks owned the institutions, they elected the management, they received guaranteed profits.
And the government provided the political cover of oversight. The system created in secret was, effectively, a banker's cartel with a government-granted monopoly over money creation. Hashtag tag 6.2. The power to create money.
But the most essential innovation, the power that superseded Morgan's need for these ad hoc private bailouts, was the authority to create money.
The Fed was given the power to issue Federal Reserve notes.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, what exactly are Federal Reserve notes?
They're the dollars in your wallet. Before the Fed, currency was complex. It was issued by various national banks. The Federal Reserve notes marked the centralization of currency issuance. And crucially, these notes could be issued not just against gold reserves, but against commercial paper.
Which essentially just bank assets.
Exactly. And this was the critical liquidity mechanism. When a bank faced a run, instead of running to Morgan, they could now sell their assets to the Fed and receive newly created Federal Reserve notes in exchange.
It meant the Fed could expand the money supply infinitely, if necessary, to prevent future bank failures.
The private banks were now protected by a system with theoretically unlimited financial capacity. Additionally, the Fed would lend money directly to banks at a rate called the discount rate. And since private banks controlled the regional Feds, they effectively gained influence over the cost of money and credit conditions across the entire country.
A massive strategic advantage.
A total game changer.
Yeah.
Hashtag tag 6.3. Implementation of the act.
Now, the initial Jekyll Island plan, the Aldrich Plan of 1911, it ultimately failed in Congress, right? It was too openly associated with Wall Street.
That's right. The political brand was toxic. But the structure itself was perfectly sound from the banker's perspective. So when Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was elected, his administration essentially took the exact structure designed on Jekyll Island.
Renamed it, made some minor cosmetic adjustments.
To appeal to farmers and small businesses, like setting up that presidential-appointed board, and introduced it as the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
And it was sold as a check on Wall Street power, a guardian for the common man against the trusts.
Despite fierce, informed opposition from opponents who recognized it as a bill drafted by bankers for bankers, the act passed Congress in December 1913. Largely because the memory of the Panic of 1907 was still fresh and politically potent, the government was desperate for a solution.
The Fed officially opened for business in November 1914, and the powers that Morgan had wielded personally in 1907 were now institutionalized. Okay, so now we arrive at the core structural flaw, the element that explains the next 110 years of financial history, the problem of moral hazard.
Let's break it down. Before the Fed, if a bank made reckless, risky loans, it faced the ultimate punishment: failure. Losses were private, absorbed by shareholders and depositors.
But the Federal Reserve fundamentally changed the rules of the game.
Completely. Now, if a bank made bad loans and faced a liquidity crisis, the Fed was structurally mandated to intervene, to lend it money, to stabilize the institution, and prevent systemic collapse.
And if those stabilized institutions eventually couldn't pay back the loan, the loss fell on the Fed and ultimately on the U.S. government and the taxpayer.
The result is immediate and predictable: the institutionalization of moral hazard. Banks are now incentivized to take exponentially greater risks because they know the Fed, unlike J.P. Morgan, who could pick and choose who to save, is now structurally obligated to save the system.
Which means saving them. They get to privatize the profits during the boom and socialize the losses during the bust.
That's the core principle. Hashtag 7.2, financing World War I and the gold link.
The Fed's first major test came almost immediately with the outbreak of World War I. And this test revealed the Fed's other primary function: financing government spending through debt monetization.
Before the Fed, the government had to rely on taxation or selling bonds directly to the public to finance conflicts. Now, the mechanism was far easier. The government sold bonds directly to the Fed.
And the Fed simply created the money, the Federal Reserve notes, to buy those bonds.
This is what's known as monetizing the debt. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the sources show the Fed expanded the money supply by a staggering 75% over the next 2 years to finance the military effort.
The immediate, unavoidable consequence was inflation.
Massive inflation. Prices across the U.S. doubled between 1914 and 1920. This huge expansion of the money supply amounted to a direct, silent transfer of wealth.
Who benefited?
The government, which paid off its war debts with cheaper dollars, and the debtors, including the banks, who repaid their loans with currency that had lost half its purchasing power.
And who lost?
Every American saver and wage earner whose purchasing power was silently destroyed by the inflation tax.
Interestingly, the sources do point to a brief moment in 1920 where the Fed acted almost like a true market disciplinarian.
Yes, 1920 offers a crucial counterexample. A post-war bubble had formed. The Federal Reserve, briefly, did what the system was supposed to do before moral hazard became fully baked in. They sharply raised interest rates and allowed the bubble to pop.
So there was a painful, swift recession.
Businesses failed, bad debts were liquidated, but the economy recovered extremely quickly. Unemployment dropped from near 12% to 3% by 1922. The market was allowed to clear the excessive debt.
That willingness to let the market clear debts completely vanished when the 1929 crash hit.
It did. The famous stock market crash was just the beginning. The Great Depression that followed, the systematic economic ruin, was, in part, exacerbated by the Federal Reserve's contractionary policy. From 1929 to 1933, the Fed allowed the money supply to shrink by a disastrous 30%.
Why would the institution that was founded to prevent systemic collapse allow such a contraction?
Well, there are multiple theories, but the outcome is what's clear. That contraction amplified a severe recession into the Great Depression. The most critical effect was this massive wave of bank failures. Over 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933.
And here is the historical irony. Most of those failed banks were small, regional, independent institutions.
They were the key competitors to the handful of large New York national banks, the very institutions that controlled the New York Federal Reserve.
So the banks associated with the Morgan and Rockefeller empires survived and flourished.
They survived, and they grew stronger by acquiring the failed assets of their competitors on the cheap. The Depression, contrary to the Fed's stated purpose of preventing financial concentration, actually facilitated the greatest consolidation of financial power in American history. It eliminated 9,000 smaller competitors and entrenched the dominance of the few remaining megabanks. Hashtag 7.4. Breaking the gold standard, 1933-1971.
The consolidation of financial power was soon followed by the consolidation of monetary power, starting in 1933 under President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Right. After Roosevelt declared the bank holiday in March 1933, He took the radical step of severing the direct link between gold and the public. He issued an executive order forbidding American citizens from owning gold coins or bullion.
Forcing them to sell their gold to the government at the then market price of $20.67 per ounce.
Exactly. And then, once the public's gold was secured, Roosevelt immediately revalued gold to $35 per ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar by 40% overnight.
And the purpose was to allow the Fed to massively inflate the currency without being constrained by domestic demands for gold conversion.
To finance the New Deal and, crucially, the massive debt of World War II.
The final nail in the coffin for the gold standard came 4 decades later in 1971.
The U.S. had financed decades of spending. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, massive social programs, by printing dollars. We printed far more dollars than we held gold to back them, even at that devalued $35 rate. When foreign central banks, notably France, became nervous and started demanding gold conversion.
President Nixon faced draining the nation's gold reserves.
So on August 15, 1971, he closed the gold window.
And that was the final definitive break.
The dollar became a pure fiat currency, meaning its value was backed only by the government's promise to accept it for taxes, not by any external constraint like gold. The Federal Reserve now had complete, unconstrained power to create money, reinforcing that moral hazard principle exponentially.
The post-1971 fiat era dramatically changed the financial environment. Without the gold restraint, inflation became a normalized, continuous reality. The 1970s brought us double-digit inflation, stagflation.
And the historical measure is just chilling. The dollar has lost approximately 85% of its purchasing power since Nixon closed the gold window.
And this isn't accidental. Inflation became the functional, structural policy.
It's the most efficient way to finance continuous increases in government spending and, critically, to monetize the ever-growing national debt. Every year, the government can borrow $1 trillion, and the Fed can ensure that debt is repaid with dollars that buy significantly less than when the debt was issued. It's a mechanism for continuous wealth transfer.
We have to mention Paul Volcker here, the only Fed chairman in the modern era who truly challenged that inflation mandate.
Volcker proved the system could be disciplined. Between 1979 and 1987, he forced a severe, painful recession by raising the federal funds rate to nearly 20%. He crushed inflation, proving that the Fed has the power to stop it.
But the political and economic pain was immense.
And since Volcker stepped down, every subsequent Federal Reserve has chosen asset price expansion and inflation over the short-term pain of true liquidation and debt clearance. Hashtag 8.2, 2008, and the ultimate bailout.
That pattern came to a head in the 2008 global financial crisis. The preceding housing bubble, which was fueled by years of excessively low Fed interest rates, finally popped.
And the financial institutions that had leveraged reckless systemic risk were facing immediate failure.
And the response followed the 1907 blueprint, but on a gargantuan, institutionalized scale.
The Federal Reserve executed the largest bailout in history. They initiated quantitative easing, or QE, creating $3.5 trillion to buy toxic mortgage-backed assets and provide liquidity backstops to the very institutions that caused the crisis.
The institutionalized moral hazard was in full view. The megabanks, the descendants of Morgan's empire like JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, were saved and made whole.
The profits of the boom were theirs, and the losses of the bust were transferred to the system. Precisely. The homeowners who were foreclosed upon received no equivalent systemic rescue. The pattern established when Morgan secured antitrust immunity for TC&I was perfected. Use the crisis, save the big institutions, ensure consolidation, and make the public absorb the risk. Hashtag 8.3, the COVID-19 expansion.
Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which provided the ultimate political justification for an unprecedented expansion of the Fed's power and its balance sheet.
In 2020 through 2022, the Federal Reserve created an astonishing $7 trillion. That's more money creation than in its entire previous history combined. And this was all done under the premise of stabilizing the economy during a health crisis.
But the economic result was a profound acceleration of inequality. Where did that money flow?
It flowed primarily into financial markets, asset purchases, and government spending. It directly inflated asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate to record highs. We saw billionaires adding $1.8 trillion to their net worth during the height of the pandemic response.
Meanwhile, ordinary Americans who rely on cash savings and wages saw consumer inflation hit 9%, rapidly alerting their savings and buying power.
This evidence, spanning from 1907 to today, it suggests a really clear pattern. The system is not failing. It is performing its primary structural function.
which is to institutionalize bailouts, transfer risk to the taxpayer, and continuously concentrate wealth upward through the mechanism of currency debasement and asset inflation.
That's the design.
So let's talk accountability. The official narrative is always one of a president-appointed board and congressional oversight. But how much real oversight exists for an institution that manages trillions of dollars and operates based on a structure designed in secret?
The illusion of government control is vital for political acceptance, but the reality is structurally different. We have to go back to that Jekyll Island design. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are private corporations owned by their member banks.
They receive that guaranteed 6% dividend, and they elect 2/3 of the regional board of directors. The bankers own the system.
And the most powerful entity in this structure is not the board in D.C., but the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Why is that?
The New York Fed handles all the open market operations. It sets global policy, and it interacts with foreign central banks. It's the operational nexus of the system, and it is governed by the largest Wall Street institutions, the modern-day descendants of Morgan's empire, including J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup. The revolving door between the leadership of the New York Fed and these major banks is constant and well documented.
And the lack of external checks is concerning. The Fed is not subject to a full congressional audit, and its operations are specifically exempt from Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests.
That opacity is absolutely critical to its power. When the Fed executed the 2008 bailout, it fiercely resisted disclosing which institutions received the money, forcing Congress and watchdog groups to sue for transparency. It operates as an unaccountable, powerful banking cartel, making decisions about the cost and availability of money that directly impact the entire nation.
Yet it's structured to prioritize the solvency and profitability of its member institutions.
That's the conflict of interest at its core. Hashtag 9.2. Structural mechanisms of wealth transfer, focusing on the listener.
So the structural design is to concentrate wealth in socialized loss. Let's detail the specific, tangible mechanisms that impact you directly. The individual whose purchasing power is constantly being eroded.
Okay, mechanism number 1, inflation, the stealth tax. We've established that since the Fed's creation in 1913, the dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. Every time the Fed creates new money, it effectively taxes existing dollar holders, transferring purchasing power away from them.
Banks and the government benefit because they're massive debtors. They repay loans and obligations with dollars that buy significantly less.
Exactly. They're essentially subsidizing their debt load by destroying the value of your savings.
Mechanism number 2, interest rates or financial repression. This is where the structural benefit to the banks becomes most evident. When the Fed sets the federal funds rate at an artificially low level near zero, like we saw for much of the last decade, it makes borrowing incredibly cheap for large financial institutions and corporations.
And those institutions take that cheap credit and they leverage it to invest in hard assets, stocks, corporate buybacks, real estate, driving asset prices to historic highs.
At the same time, the ordinary saver, the listener who relies on a savings account or a CD, is forced to accept negative real returns.
Meaning the interest they earn is lower than the rate of inflation. This financially represses the middle class, forcing you to either consume less or take greater risk by entering the asset markets where the banks profit from fees and trading.
Okay, mechanism number 3, quantitative easing, QE, or direct profit transfer. This is the modern post-2008 iteration of the bailout.
When the Fed buys assets from banks during QE, it often does so specifically to inject liquidity into the banking system. Sources suggest that in times of crisis, the Fed frequently pays above market prices for toxic or illiquid assets, creating an instant guaranteed profit for the bank.
And that freshly created money then flows directly into inflating financial assets, which specifically benefits those who own those assets, the wealthy, elite, and large institutions.
It's a highly efficient, closed-loop transfer of new capital.
And finally, mechanism number 4, bailouts, the moral hazard revisited. This is the permanent legacy of 1907.
The system guarantees that banks can take massive risks, knowing that the structural obligation of the Federal Reserve is to prevent systemic failure. This creates an asymmetrical outcome: privatized profits during the boom, secured by a lack of government intervention.
And guaranteed socialized losses during the bust, secured by the mandatory intervention of the Fed.
The entire system is built on this core principle, inherited directly from J.P. Morgan's strategic rescues and the subsequent need to institutionalize that power. Hashtag tag outro.
This has been an incredible deep dive, tracing the trajectory from a chaotic, decentralized system of 20,000 independent banks to the near collapse of 1907 JP Morgan's masterful and strategic rescues, the secret design meeting at Jekyll Island, and the implementation of a Federal Reserve System that promised public stability but guaranteed the dominance of the financial elite.
The evidence across more than a century from World War I inflation to the Great Depression consolidation, from the collapse of the gold standard to the massive bailouts of 2008 and 2020, it strongly suggests that the Federal Reserve System is not broken or incompetent. It is working exactly as it was designed to work by the bankers who created it 118 years ago.
To institutionalize bailouts, transfer financial gear to the taxpayer.
And continuously concentrate wealth upward through the mechanism of inflation and asset price expansion.
The Panic of 1907 created the necessary political fear. It presented the American public with a simple, terrifying dilemma: accept the solution offered by the powerful bankers or face economic ruin.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to consider. If the only protection offered against systemic financial ruin requires handing over control of the nation's money supply to the very institutions that caused the crisis and who profit structurally from the resulting currency inflation, was the price of being saved truly worth the permanent structural cost to your own economic freedom and purchasing power?